Good afternoon. It's a real pleasure to be here to talk about legislative and ideological responses to terrorism. Today we're joined by a very distinguished panel. First of all, we have Congresswoman Tulsi Gabbard, who represents the 2nd District in Hawaii. She is an Iraq War veteran and the sponsor of the Stop Arming Terrorists bill. We also have Professor Jawad Sayed, who's a professor of organizational behavior at the University of Huddersfield in the United Kingdom, Professor Edwina Pio, who's a professor of diversity at Auckland University of Technology in New Zealand and a Fulbright scholar, and last but by no means least, Professor Tahir Kamran, who is the head of history at Government College, University of Lahore, and in 2013 to 15 was the Iqbal Professor at the University of Cambridge School for South Asian Studies. Congresswoman Gabbard, would you like to start?
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, welcome, aloha, and assalamu alaikum. It's truly an honor to be here today with this distinguished panel to take part in this effort to discuss and change the narrative and policies that we are working on in Washington with regards to the issue of terrorism and the ideology that drives it. I first want to say thank you to the organizers, to the Interfaith for Unity and Tolerance, and of course for everyone for taking the time to be here today. There are many different elements that I know that we'll get into discussing in great detail, but I'd like to mention first the bill that I've introduced, a bipartisan bill in the House of Representatives, as you mentioned, called the Stop Arming Terrorists Act. This bill has also been introduced in the Senate by my colleague, Senator Rand Paul, and essentially it's a bill that does what the title says. It would prohibit the US government from providing any type of training, money, assistance, or logistical support to armed militants who are allied with or even often working under the command of terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS. We are seeing this happening today in places like Syria and Yemen, in addition to our government funneling money through countries like Saudi Arabia and Turkey and they're providing that support to terrorist groups. So my bill, very simply, would put an end to that madness. And we can go into it in a little bit more detail later. But we've seen, unfortunately, the tragic consequences of our failed interventionist policies, both in this regard, but also with the various regime change wars that we've led over the years, most recently in Iraq, Libya, and Syria. We've seen how in each instance these wars have resulted in either the creation of or the strengthening of these terrorist groups, and therefore inflicted immeasurable death, pain, and human suffering, what to speak of the chaos and instability as well. Just in this holy month of Ramadan that will soon come to an end here, where Muslims around the world are fasting, spending time in prayer and increased devotion. Unfortunately, we've seen a rise in terrorist attacks in different parts of the world, from Baghdad to Kabul, from Brussels to London, and even here at home in the United States. We've seen vicious attacks that have killed or wounded hundreds of people. It's unfortunate there are so many examples of this, but it points to the fact that after 16 years since the attack on 9/11 occurred here in New York City, we are farther than ever from achieving peace and defeating these terrorist groups who launched that attack on us. In fact, you can point to our entire approach to combating terrorism and find all of the ways that it has been counterproductive. So instead of actually making us and the world safer, it has created more chaos and instability and death and suffering. It's the ideology that we're going to be discussing here today of intolerance and hatred of those who choose to follow a different path or worship a different God or even love in a different way that is at the heart of this. So there is much action that needs to be taken. Yes, there is military action. Yes, there is change in policies and politics. But there is also action that must be taken to defeat this exclusivist ideology that is driving these terrorist groups like Al-Qaeda and ISIS to conduct their vicious and horrific attacks.
Thank you very much, Congresswoman. Professor, would you like to open your remarks?
Thank you, Kaz. First, I would like to offer a brief update on my affiliation. I used to be at the University of Huddersfield, but now I'm at Lahore University of Management Sciences. So in addition to what Professor Tahir Kamran already said, I would like to provide a perspective on the book and the book's project, its motivation and its contribution to the discourse on terrorism. Back in 2015, Professor Tahir Kamran, Professor Edwina Pio, and another co-editor, Professor Abbas Zaidi, who is at University of New South Wales in Australia, and myself, we got together and we agreed that we were not happy and we were not satisfied with the current discourse on terrorism in the mainstream media and academic scholarship. So exactly along the same lines which Representative Tulsi Gabbard is currently pursuing in Congress, we thought that there is a need for a clear discourse and there is a need for clear identification and engagement with the sources of terror. And that's how this book's project came into being. So there were a number of false binaries which we wanted to clarify or highlight. The first false binary which we wanted to highlight through this book and through other scholarships was Islam versus West. That terrorism is an outcome of Islam versus West tensions. So that is something which we do not agree with. That is something which we have clarified here. The second common binary which is often presented in the mainstream media is Muslim versus Christians, or Muslim versus Jews, or Muslims versus Hindus, or Muslim versus non-Muslims. We do not agree with this binary, and we have shown through empirical data as well as ideological discussions that victims of terrorism, they include both Muslims and non-Muslims. In fact, majority of victims, they happen to be Muslims, and within Muslims, the majority of victims happen to be Sunni Muslims. The third binary which we did not agree with and we wanted to confront was Sunni versus Shia. Often in mainstream media and scholarship, terrorism is presented as a Sunni versus Shia problem. And through empirical data, we have demonstrated that terrorism is much wider than that. It's not only Shia Muslims, or it's not only Christians or Ahmadis, but also Sunni Muslims. In fact, the majority of victims happen to be Sunnis. And the majority of perpetrators, in fact, exclusively all perpetrators, they happen to come from Wahhabi, Salafi and Deobandi communities. This is empirically proven through various databases within Pakistan, also across the world. Another thing, another binary which we were not happy with, which we still consider is a simplistic binary, is a Saudi Arabia versus Iran binary. We think that this is not an accurate descriptor and description of terrorism, and despite our disagreements or agreements with the policies of these governments, both of these governments and their respective citizens, they are also victim of terrorism. Another binary which we did not agree with, which is often presented sometimes in Marxist circles, is that terrorism is a reaction of the have-nots against haves. That those who are developed and those who are more prosperous, they are facing terrorism at the hands of those who are have-nots, those who are deprived economically or socially or whatever. But indeed, we have many examples. We know that 9 out of 11 hijackers responsible for 9/11, they came from Saudi Arabia. They were not the have-nots. They came from the upper middle class or upper socio-economic strata. So they were surely not the have-nots. So once having identified this, that what terrorism is not, it is extremely important for all of us, as academics, as legislators, as media persons, as activists, to identify what terrorism is. And that is where, once again, we have to go to the empirical data, that what exactly is common in Boko Haram in Africa, in Al-Nusra Front in Syria, in ISIS in Syria, Iraq, and elsewhere, in Taliban and Sipahi Sahaba in Afghanistan and Pakistan, and so on and so forth. What exactly is common? The only thing which we were able to identify which is common is the Salafi, Wahhabi, and Deobandi ideology. Now, Deobandi ideology, as Professor Kamran very accurately described, has been influenced by a jihadist and puritanical version of Islam, which is very much akin to Wahhabism or Salafism. I must clarify that by no means we are suggesting that all Salafis or Wahhabis or all Deobandis happen to be terrorists. No, majority of them are as moderate, as peace-loving as you and I. But indeed, that doesn't detract us from the fact that 100% of suicide bombings, whether they are happening in the US, whether they are happening in the UK or Pakistan, they are coming from either Deobandi, Salafis or Wahhabis. 100%. 100% of attacks on Pakistan's military, Pakistan government, and all other, even the public school massacre in Peshawar. It was a tragic massacre that was perpetrated by Deobandi militants. So therefore, it is important that once for all, we must not use generic sweeping terms such as Islamist or Muslim terrorists. We should specify them that these are extremists within Salafi, Wahhabi, and Deobandi communities. Clear identification is step number one. And step number two is now we need to engage with them. We need to try to reform them. We need to try to very carefully look at what exactly is being disseminated through their madrasas and through their mosques and through their literature and through their social media. And we also have to be very careful about, in terms of government support and funding, that what kind of groups are those which are currently being supported by our respective governments. And that is where Representative Tulsi Gabbard's bill is very much relevant, because indeed we are heartbroken when we come to know, and things are documented, that unfortunately due to some mishandling of policy, some of the US aid or US weapons have ended up in hands of Al-Nusra Front in Syria, and indeed we are also not happy with the what do you call it, very expensive arms deal with Saudi Arabia, Qatar, and all those countries. These countries also have to be more responsible. These countries themselves, they are victim of terrorism. Only yesterday, an extremist terrorist, he tried to explode himself in Mecca, the holiest place, the holiest mosque of Muslims. So I think that Muslims, including Sunni, Shia, Sufi, Salafi, and Deobandi Muslims, they have to understand that these Takfiri, Deobandis, Salafis, and Wahhabi extremists, they do not represent anyone. They have to be treated in a manner which is not only lawful, in a manner which is not only educative, but if at all we have to use legislative and punitive measures, we should do it.
Well, thank you very much for that. It's statistically just very useful to know that there is this particular set of ideologies from which every single one, and you seem very categorical about that, but every single one of the people that have committed these terrible atrocities are drawn. Now, of course, as you said, not every person that belongs to those particular versions of Islam exhibits those traits, but nevertheless, there seems to be some kind of combination of ideology, of personal psychology, and of circumstance that leads to these really quite terrible acts. And certainly there seems to be no shortage of young men, women as well, but mainly men, who are willing to destroy themselves and hundreds of other people.
Namai Harimai, Tenakotu, and welcome. I'm speaking right now in Tirio, the indigenous language of the Maori, and I live in New Zealand, and I got involved with this book and with my wonderful co-editors because I thought, one, it was important to have a voice that was a feminine voice, a feminist point of view, a woman's voice. Two, I think it's really important that Muslims in general, Muslim men in general, are not demonized. And it's from that point of view that we have a chapter in there on Christian persecution in Pakistan. Also Christians in many parts of the world, for example in Egypt, in Pakistan of course, have been raped, have been shot at, their shrines have been desecrated. And again, it's not Islam in general, but it's a particular group of people, as my colleagues mentioned right now. As a mother, and as many other mothers around the world, I know in New Zealand, the most peaceful country in the world, a number of mothers, Muslim mothers, get up in the morning, reach for their cell phone, and check out to see if there have been any atrocities around the world. Because they need to prepare their children for when they go to school to be able to respond to the fact that a number of school children and teachers as well might believe that they are responsible for these atrocious acts. Consider also another mother in another part of the world who's just said her prayers, her namaz, and she and her husband are concerned about their highly educated millennial children or young adults. Is one of them going to be a jihadi bride? Is one going to be a suicide bomber? These are issues that anguish people and that hurt people, and we have a wounded consciousness etched into the memories of the collective unconscious in many parts of the world. If you look at what happened, for example, in Australia, Sydney, the Cronulla beach riots, if you look at what happened in Bali, the terrorist bombings over there, Manchester, London Bridge, a host of different places where mothers, fathers weep over what has happened, and where Muslim mothers and fathers, unfortunately, are not necessarily profiled by the press in ways which show them as being positive. All Muslims are not terrorists, which is really the purpose of our book. And while it's not a red book, we hope that it will become a manual for being a blue book and exploding a number of myths that are there. And in this context, I would like to mention three main aspects. One is we tend to forget that all of us as humans are part of a diversity discourse. We need to move away from, if I use Amartya Sen's terminology, the miniaturization of human beings, where we see people only through one lens, as being either a Muslim or a mother or a father. And if I look at myself, I'm a mother, I could be a follower of a particular religion, I could be a scholar of color, a poet, an artist, etc. So I'm all of these, but I might choose to pick up a certain aspect of myself for a certain situation. So that's the first point I want to emphasize. The second point I would like to emphasize is that education, right from primary up to universities, as well as induction programs in organizations, be they in the civil sector or in the private sector or the public sector, need to emphasize the creation of rationally compassionate disruptors. We have to be able to look at issues from a number of points of view. And the third aspect I would like to emphasize is the importance of securitization in tandem with social cohesion. We do need laws, but we also need to see that we build up capacity. And perhaps that's one thing that was lacking in terms of Christians in Pakistan, where it's still viewed that the majority of them, in figures, yes, that's true, come from the low socioeconomic status, but you also have many who came from different parts of India. At that time, the Portuguese owned and controlled section of Goa, who went to Pakistan. One of the first mayors of Karachi was a Christian Goan. You've got people who started minority organizations. We have people who were brigadiers in charge of atomic energy, etc. So by erasure, we do not create equality. And I think that's really very important to remember. In fact, if we look at what Khalil Gibran, the Lebanese poet, said, truth is really a deep kindness. And also if we look at what Rumi says, I think it's important to sell our cleverness and buy bewilderment, to understand that we need to be open in a number of different ways to multiple viewpoints. Thank you very much for this opportunity. It's a pleasure to sit at the same table as Tulsi and my other colleagues.
Thank you so much. Professor Kamran, if you'd like to...
Well, I'll give some of the historical perspective to the extremism that Pakistan faces. So, and in order to fully appreciate the problem of extremism, one has to acknowledge that there exists no rational sectarian profiling of the country, whereas historically moderate Brahmanis form a numerical majority. Pakistani religious politics is dominated by the exclusionary, aggressive, and strict Deobandis, who form only 25 to 27% of the total majority, total population of Pakistan. Through their long interface with Deobandis, the Brahmanis over time, and that's my prime worry, the Brahmanis over time have also become more aggressive. Add to the mix the Shia community organized under sectarian banners and the largely neglected and demonized Ahmadiyya people. And you have a melting pot of religious strife that is manifested in sectarianism and extremism. The rise and consolidation of Deobandi Islam in the subcontinent can be traced to the British colonial era, and that's the historical perspective, of course. It is true that the roots of this extremist and sectarian version of Islam lies in the pre-colonial times. The rise of political Islam is a historic phenomenon that unfolded over time, and it is an oversimplification to think that it's a 19th century phenomenon. However, for the purpose of this talk, I want to focus on the 19th century as a period when political Islam became a force to be reckoned with in the Indian subcontinent. An 18th century Islamic scholar, Shah Waliullah, sowed the seeds of the Muslim sense of superiority and urged Indian Muslims to assert their identity as a religious group, looking towards a unified conception of the Islamic Ummah transcending the geographical confines. He invited Ahmad Shah Abdali to attack Hindu India to establish Muslim empire. It was this thought pattern of exclusion and hatred that made religion a paramount force in the social life of India. Whereas before this, there was a culture of pluralistic acceptance of cultures, religions, sects, and other markers of identity. The Islam that Waliullah brought shifted the focus to religious ritual based on a belief that Islam had been polluted by its acceptance of other influences and needed to be purified. We were talking about this conception of bid'at, that is invention or the deviation from the accepted path of Islamic purity. And Shah Waliullah was the first one who started talking against this bid'at. That made the whole discourse of Islam ahistorical. It cut it out from the history or the changes that history wrought on the religious tradition. This shift in 18th century India is best understood as a change from shrine or dargah-centric culture to the mosque or madrasa-centric culture. The Sufi or caretaker or spiritual guide at the shrines used to be men of an accommodating disposition. The dargah would act as a community center, particularly in rural or semi-rural cultures. It was a place where people could come for free food, which was called langar, shelter, and even an amenity like free oil to burn in their clay lamps at home. The shift to madrasa displaced the shrine as the center of community life. Initially, the mosque became the center of community gatherings as well as a place for shelter. When the British Empire was firmly established in India as a result of 1857, a strong indigenous reaction sprang up from the religious classes in India. It is critical here to note that the reformist movements were not only limited to Muslims, and Hindu reformist movements like Arya Samaj also encouraged the same kind of exclusion and hatred that Muslim reformists did. I will, however, only highlight the role of Darul Uloom Deoband, which was established in 1867. This was the real and logical culmination of the exclusionism initiated by Waliullah. The primacy of the madrasa had already started to be accepted, but particularly as a consequence of the rise of Deobandi Islam, the Muslims of India were pulled away from the pluralistic and inclusive dargah culture towards the culture of hatred revolving around the mosque or the masjid. Most importantly, Islam in India became centered on scripture, Quran and Hadith, particularly Hadith. Hadith is the tradition of the Prophet. What this achieved was that the Maulvi and Madrasa appropriated the right to interpret the scripture, whereas the Sufi scholars' interpretation was inclusive of the various religious and philosophical or intellectual strains in the Indian subcontinent. The so-called religious scholar shifted the focus to a unified, singular, and uncontestable version of Islam. This was all due to the rise and popularity of Deobandi Islam. Thus, Islam was turned into religion of rituals. As the partition of the subcontinent, it took Deobandi Islam only a couple of years to assert itself in national politics. The Majlis-e-Tahaffuz-e-Khatm-e Nabuwat was formed as an extension of Majlis-e-Ihrar Islam with an agenda of exclusion on religious basis. The Ihrar, dominated by Deobandi clerics, had not only been supporters had not been supporters of Pakistan, they were anti-Pakistan at the very outset, had not been supporters of the Pakistan movement and were relegated to the margins after Pakistan was created. In 1949, they got a chance to regroup, and in 1953, they led anti-Ahmadiyya protests in Pakistan, thus establishing themselves in Pakistani politics. This eventually led to the passage of legislation disbanding the Ahmadiyya community as non-Muslims in 1974. This unprecedented piece of legislation based on hatred and exclusion was a natural corollary of the politics of Deoband since the 19th century. However, this did not stop here. In 1985, the Spy Sahaba Pakistan was formed, which advocated killing the Shia community because of what Spy Sahaba leaders considered to be their un-Islamic practices. Pakistani politics has since been unable to get rid of the menace of sectarianism. I have previously highlighted how Deobandi reimagining of Islam turned the shift from spiritual to ritual. Religious ritual turned jihad into a religious obligation which demanded to be followed ritualistically. The madrasa now became a center for organizing and financing jihad. Ziaul Haq's decision to join Afghan jihad after Soviet Union occupied Afghanistan in 1979 was a result of this ritualistic belief. As a result, religious extremism, sectarianism, and a culture of exclusion and hatred was indelibly entrenched in Pakistani politics. I have tried to point out some salient moments in the rise of political Deobandi Islam in the Indian subcontinent. The main point to stress here is that this version of political Islam excludes all others and does not leave room for humanity and pluralistic values. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for that incredibly useful short history of Deobandism. A lot of people have heard of the term Wahhabi or Salafi, and it's very, very useful to understand that there are parallel traditions in other parts of the Muslim world which also contain within them tendencies that can become militant. We know, for example, that many of the San Bernardino attacker came from a Deobandi background rather than a straightforwardly Wahhabi background. So these are really important and interesting things for us to learn about the roots and the historical growth of these ideologies and their placement within the culture over time. So thank you very much for that. I should mention, by the way, the book, which is Faith-Based Militancy and Deobandi Violence in Pakistan, a collection of 18 essays. Congressman, first of all, I'd like to ask you why you brought the bill. What inspired it?
Knowing and understanding what the policy of our government has been brought about a call to action, the need for this legislation. It's something that as I speak with different groups of people, even members of Congress about, you would think, why would you need a bill like this? Because current US law already exists that say it's illegal for you or me or any American to provide any type of support or assistance to terrorist groups. If one does that, then you will be arrested and be put in jail. But the problem is that our government has been violating this principle now for years through CIA programs specifically that has been providing different types of arms and support, intelligence and other things to armed militants in Syria who are allied with and often working under the command of what has been known as al-Nusra or al-Qaeda's branch in Syria, all in this regime change war that continues to be waged on today in Syria by the United States, Saudi Arabia, Turkey, Qatar, and these other countries. It has also been happening indirectly through the support that we've been providing through these countries, like Saudi Arabia, Turkey, and Qatar, countries who have been providing both direct and indirect support of various types to these terrorist groups. So recognizing and knowing these facts that have been widely reported now, at least in the last couple of years, required action. And that's what drove me to draft and introduce the bipartisan bill, the Stop Arming Terrorists Act, in the House. And again, as I mentioned earlier, which Senator Rand Paul has introduced in the Senate. This is a bill that unfortunately requires education because many people are not aware of the policies that our government has had and continues to have in this area. But it is something that once people are aware of is common sense, that we need to get Congress to support and pass this bill and bring about an end to this madness that has resulted in the strengthening of the very terrorist group that was responsible for the attack on 9/11, that continues to be responsible for the unimaginable human suffering and death that we've seen in many different parts of the world, specifically in these countries like Syria and Yemen, where the humanitarian crisis is difficult to grasp. The recent massive arms deal that the United States has just struck with Saudi Arabia is another example of this, compounding the support that we've already been providing in that proxy war that is occurring in Yemen, where the Yemeni people are suffering as a result. We know that there is support being provided to al-Qaeda in Yemen from Saudi Arabia with our assistance in this war for the leadership of Yemen. So there are many different examples, unfortunately, that brought about the need for this legislation, the urgent need for it to be passed.
Thank you so much for that very comprehensive answer. My final question to you is, what was the reception among your fellow congressmen and women when you brought this act?
It's been mixed. Again, there are many members of Congress who are not studying very closely what's been happening in these countries and are not aware of the situation. There are some members of Congress who were immediately committed to signing on to the legislation and helping to get it passed. And unfortunately, there are others who are aware of the situation, but who have a different set of priorities and who believe, well, it's more important to conduct a regime change war than it is to make sure that we're not actually providing arms and support of various types to jihadists who are fighting this regime change war. So it is a very wrong-headed set of priorities, in my opinion, where our policy has clearly not only been counterproductive to our interests and the safety and security of the American people, but it has also been counterproductive to the people in these countries, like Syria and like Yemen, who are suffering gravely as a result.
Congressman, we really, really appreciate your time and your
much.
efforts on behalf of the American people and indeed the people who are suffering all over the world.
I just want to thank everyone here, and I know Congressman Gabbard has taken a lot of time for us, but I just want to say that the future leaders of the world and the United States will be like Congressman Gabbard. I wish Tulsi all the best. Our prayers, our good wishes are with her. I hope she continues to lead the discourse which will bring peace to the world. And the only way to do that is to work with the academia, to work and promote books and promote writings and promote research which clearly identify the ideologies of the culprits. We do not need to get into these old narratives where, as Professor Jawad Saeed so eloquently put, that we have these false binaries and false narratives that don't work anymore. We have to identify correctly that, as an example, 2 chapters in the book refers to the Deobandis in the UK. 40% of the mosques in the UK are Deobandi. As members of the press here and online know that there have been a lot of terrorist attacks in the UK, and they're all done by, unfortunately, Deobandi militants. We have nothing against the Deobandi sect. We just want to clearly point out where the problem is, instead of lumping it in the large umbrella of Islam and hiding it. That's what the book does. That's why IFUT was created. Its purpose is to clearly identify the culprits and fix the problem through education. We want to create education for not only the Muslim communities, but all communities, and for them to understand. And my hats off to Congressman Gabbard, who understood this early and led the discourse. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Ali.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you.